Good morning or good afternoon, class. Mr. Long here once again with our second official video lecture. You guys are going to have to excuse my voice, still a little under the weather. I sound a little different. So please excuse my voice and hopefully we can get through this video lecture and you guys have an understanding of exactly what is going on in England in the 1600s and the 1700s. So we just talked about in regards to what government is and what the purpose of government is. There's several different types of governments, examples of different governments. You have a democracy like we have here in the United States. You have a monarchy like you have, say, in England. You have other like fascist countries or even communist countries like you would have in North Korea. So there are several different types of governments that we will talk all about throughout the entire year, but really this first unit is going to be centered around democracy and monarchy. And when I say monarchy, I want everyone to really think of a king or a queen. One person that has absolute rule over their subjects or their people. Now, there's going to be two types of monarchies. There's going to be an absolute monarchy, which I just mentioned. And absolute monarchy means that the king or queen really don't have to listen to anyone. They have the final say. They make all decisions, and they basically get to do whatever they want. They have unlimited power, and they actually have what is known as divine right. And divine right means they get all of their power from God. The only person that they ever have to answer to is God. So they really don't have to listen to anyone, and they make all the decisions and they can do whatever they want. The other type of monarchy that we are going to discuss, we will discuss it more or less for today, is a constitutional monarchy. So we are going to have a transition from an absolute monarchy to an constitutional monarchy. Now, a constitutional monarchy sounds like what it is. The king or queen has to follow a set of rules or laws. So whenever I say the term constitution, you all should be thinking a constitution is like a long list of rules and laws that not only the people that live in that country have to follow, but also the leaders of that country have to follow. So there's a big difference between absolute monarchy and a constitutional monarchy. So in today's video lecture, we are going to discuss several different English kings and how it will transition from having all power to these kings having to follow a set of rules and laws just like everyone else living in that country. So we're going to go ahead and start out with Queen Elizabeth. Now in front of you guys, besides your Chromebooks listening to this video lecture, you have a handout front and back. And this is known as a guided reading. There's questions that you're going to have to fill in or actually fill in the blanks. So you're going to really have to pay attention to this video lecture in order to correctly fill out the handout front and back. So let's go ahead and talk about Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth, she is going to die in the year 1603. Now, Queen Elizabeth does not have any sons or any daughters, which means she has no one to take her place after she dies. Now, that is what a monarchy is all about. The monarchy stays within the family, so the throne stays within the family. So that is why it's very important for kings and queens to have children. And of course, it has to do with the oldest child, the oldest male specifically. And from there, it works its way down. So, for example, if Queen Elizabeth did have, say, 2 sons, she dies, her oldest son will take over and become King of England. And when he dies, his brother, his younger brother, which would be Queen Elizabeth's youngest son, would then take over as king. But it doesn't work that way because Queen Elizabeth does not have any children. So, a couple things about Queen Elizabeth is that she leaves England in major debt. England does not have any money, and she makes financial words a little bit more difficult for the English people. So whoever takes over after Queen Elizabeth needs to figure out how to solve that economic problem, that financial problem. So what ends up happening, since she does not have a son or a daughter, she cannot leave the throne to anyone, obviously with no kids, so she has to leave it to her closest relative. And her closest relative is James the First. Now, James the First is the cousin of Elizabeth, but he is already King of Scotland. So not only is he King of Scotland, but he is now going to inherit or become the King of England. So he will rule over two separate countries. And if you guys take a look at that map, obviously England and Scotland, they border each other. They're very close in proximity or location to each other. So he now rules Scotland and he also rules England. Now I really want you to think about possible problems that could rise up with King James I being king of two separate countries. What might work in Scotland may not work in England and vice versa. So it's really important that you guys understand that there's going to be lots and lots of problems when someone is already king of a country and they take over another country and they become king of that country. So James I does not get along with Parliament. Now, I'm going to mention Parliament several times in this video lecture. Parliament is almost like our Congress here in the United States. Parliament will work with the king or queen and they will help govern the country. They will help create laws for the country. So if you want things to run smoothly in a country, Parliament and the king or queen should really get along. But when James I takes over as King of England, he does not get along with Parliament at all. And he really doesn't get along with Parliament for numerous reasons, but one major reason is over religion. Majority of the people in Parliament are Puritans. And a Puritan is a branch of Christianity, it's a form of Christianity. And he refused to make Puritan reforms, and this is really going to make Parliament upset because the majority of Parliament is Puritans. Well, he is not. Okay? And one major thing that we need to know, and I will always come back to this, is that they did not like Catholics. They did not like Catholics whatsoever. So it's really important that we all know that James I did not get along with Parliament because they were Puritans, and he was more along the Anglican branch of Christianity. So what ends up happening when James I dies is his son Charles I will take over, and he will rule, just like his father did, over Scotland and England. And he becomes king in the year 1625. When Charles takes over, he needs money, and he needs money badly. And the only way for a king or queen back in the day to get their money is to ask permission from Parliament. Parliament will grant them permission, and they will give them money to do whatever they need to do with the money. And Charles I needs the money because they are fighting two countries. England's fighting two countries. They're fighting against France, and they're also fighting against Spain. And it's important to know, of course, it takes a lot of money to finance a war. So if he doesn't have any money, he needs to go to Parliament, and he needs to get money from Parliament. Now, Parliament refuses to give Charles I money. So what does he do? Charles I dissolves Parliament. Now, if you dissolve Parliament, dissolves means to get rid of, to no longer recognize, to no longer acknowledge, as if Parliament never existed. So Charles I does not get his way. He doesn't get money from Parliament. So he dissolves it. He no longer acknowledges or pays attention to Parliament at all. But that's going to create a major problem because one man cannot rule a country. He is going to need the help from other people. So that's very important that we understand that. Continuation of Charles I. Charles is desperate at this point. So he takes over in 1625. He dissolves Parliament. 3 years later in 1628, he asks Parliament for money. And he's really desperate at this point, and he needs money to continue to fight, to continue to finance this war, and to try and attempt to get England out of debt. Now, Parliament refuses to give any money to Charles I until Charles signs a very important document. And this very important document is known as the Petition of Rights. Now, there is 4 major parts to the Petition of Rights that everyone in this class needs to know. The first one is the king, or Charles I, cannot imprison subjects without due cause. So back in the day before the Petition of Rights, if Charles I or the King of England did not like you for some reason, they could just throw you in prison for the rest of your life, lock you up, throw away the key, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now I want you to think of our system today, our judicial system. If you are accused of a crime, you don't go straight to prison. What happens in between? Well, of course, you will go to court and you will appear in front of a judge and a jury. And it is the job of the judge and the jury to find a person either guilty or innocent. And if a person is found guilty of a crime, then they are sentenced to whatever that crime was, depending on the severity of the crime. So a sentence could be a fine, it could be jail time, just depending on what that person did. That is a whole process, which means if you think about it, even people that commit crimes, even criminals, get some sort of basic rights, but not before the Petition of Rights. If you committed any sort of crime, petty crimes, you could be thrown in jail for the rest of your life and you could do nothing about it and no one else can do anything about it either. So that's a very important point for the Petition of Rights. Point number 2. The king cannot levy taxes without Parliament's consent. Now, a key word in there is levy. If you levy something, that means you raise it. So, in other words, the king is not allowed to raise taxes on his subjects or the people living in England without the consent of who? Of course, Parliament. Parliament, remember, everyone, works with the king or queen. They work every day, or they should be working every day with each other to make sure that the country is running smoothly. They make laws, they help out the king and queen and vice versa. So it's really important they have a good relationship. And of course, Charles I does not have a good relationship with Parliament. Point number 3, the king cannot house soldiers in private homes. Now, hopefully, or maybe you guys remember this from U.S. history during the Revolutionary War, but in England, it doesn't matter if you own your own home at all. If you see soldiers walking down the street and it's getting dark, it's getting nighttime, they could literally knock on your door. They could come in and you would be forced to house or allow soldiers to stay in your house overnight with a place to stay and food to eat. You don't have any sort of rights whatsoever. So the king cannot house soldiers in private homes anymore. The king cannot allow soldiers to do this anymore according to the Petition of Right. So if you think about this, what I've just stated so far, the first 3 points, this is giving more rights to the subjects, to the people, and it's taking a little bit of power away from the king or queen, which means we're going to start transitioning from that absolute monarch and transition into that constitutional monarchy. And last but not least, finally, the king is not allowed to impose martial law in peacetime. Martial law means the military basically taking over the government. And this happens during a time of war, when there's a war going on and you're involved with a war. According to the Petition of Rights, the army cannot take over the government at all during peacetime, when there's no war being fought. So Charles I, once again, is forced to sign this Petition of Rights if he wants money, and he desperately needs money. So what does he do? Of course, he signs the Petition of Rights. But after signing the Petition of Rights, he completely ignores it. It's like he shook every single person's hand in Parliament and said, okay, I promise, I promise, I promise. And then with his other hand, he's crossing his fingers behind his back because he's lying to everyone. He completely ignored the Petition of Rights. Right after he got the money, what did he do with Parliament again? He dissolved Parliament, which means he got rid of Parliament. He no longer recognized Parliament. He did not acknowledge Parliament. Right after Parliament gave him money. And of course, Charles I, after he runs through all that money that was given to him by Parliament, what happens? He runs out of it, and he needs more. So what does he do? He doesn't go back to Parliament because he knows he no longer can do that anymore. And he knows that Parliament just absolutely despises him at this point. And what he does is that he raises taxes on his subjects. And he forces the people of England to pay taxes to him so he can get the money and do whatever he wants to with the money. And once again, that's a big no-no, especially with the Petition of Rights, what I just went over. But he does it anyways. And Charles I is a big, big supporter of the Anglican Church. And this is going to really, really offend the Puritans. And remember, the Puritans make up a majority of Parliament. And the Anglicans and the Puritans, they don't get along at all. Charles I also goes a step further. He tries to force all of his people living in Scotland and England to follow one religion. And I'll tell you guys right now, and this is going to happen all throughout history, and we'll talk about it again, but you should not, if you are a leader, mess with people's belief systems and their religions, because that will make them fight back. That will make them rebel. That will make them revolt. And that's exactly what happens. Scotland threatens to invade England. And of course, what happens? If Scotland is threatening to invade England, Charles is going to need money once again to fight off Scotland from invading England. Now remember, he rules over both countries. He's trying to force both countries to follow one religion. If Scotland and England is fighting against each other, this is now going to become a civil war. Now, I realize a civil war is when a country fights its own country, and now we're talking about Scotland fighting against England, but remember, you got to look at it as almost one country because Charles I rules over both of them. So his only option now at this point is to attempt to go to Parliament. Even after he dissolved Parliament for the second time, even after Parliament gave him money and he promised to follow Petition of Rights, he has to go back to Parliament because he has no money. He can't raise taxes anymore because people don't have money. So what ends up happening is the English Civil War breaks out. And it breaks out from the year 1642 to 1649. And the supporters of Charles I are called the Royalists. And the opponents of Charles I are obviously the Puritans, but they are also given the nickname of the Roundheads, and they were given this nickname because of their haircut that they had back in the day. Um, so you have the Royalists, and then you have the Puritans slash Roundheads. And English war is when you fight against your own people, or Civil War, excuse me, is when you fight against your own people. So at this point, Charles I is absolutely despised. He is hated by many, many people. And they need to get Charles I out of there. They need to get him um, caught. He cannot rule England anymore. He's not a good leader. And everyone knows that, including himself. And they find a Puritan general by the name of Oliver Cromwell. And he actually catches Charles I in 1649. He catches him, he brings him back to the courts, and they find Charles I guilty of treason, and they actually sentence him to death. And this is the first time in English history that a reigning monarch, which means a monarch that is, or a king that is a king at the present time, will face a public execution. And that's exactly what happens to Charles I. He is executed publicly in front of the English subjects, which means England now has no king. England has no ruler. They have no leader, and they need someone. Well, of course, everyone's looking at Oliver Cromwell as a hero for catching Charles I. So Cromwell takes over, and he becomes the leader of England and Scotland, of course. And the first thing he does is he abolishes the monarchy. Now, if you abolish something, that also means you get rid of it. Okay? It's like you throw it in the trash can. You no longer recognize it, and you get rid of it. So there is no longer a monarchy anymore. There's no longer the title of a king or queen. And he establishes what is known as the Commonwealth. Now, the Commonwealth is a form of a republic. And a republic is a form of a democracy. Now, under a republic, I want you guys to think of here in the United States, we are a form of a republic. We elect officials, government officials. And those government officials will make decisions for us, just like we elect the United States president. And that president will become our leader, and he will represent the people of the United States of America. Same idea here. Cromwell establishes a republic, and he calls it the Commonwealth. But that Commonwealth is very, very shortly lived. Within a few months, he abolishes it, he gets rid of it, and he basically becomes a military dictator. And remember, I've already mentioned that he was a Puritan general. So he is backed up by the army. He has lots and lots of power, and he's a very, very strong leader. Now, there was problems going on in Ireland. So Cromwell and his troops invade Ireland, and they put down an uprising, a rebellion that's going on in Ireland at the time. As a result of that, Cromwell takes all the Irish land and he gives it out to his soldiers. Okay? Now, according to Cromwell, he's, of course, a hardcore Puritan, and he is going to instill his Puritan beliefs on his English subjects. So the laws that he creates with Parliament, and remember, Parliament is mostly made up of Puritans, are going to be laws that favor Puritan morality. Activities that are going to be banned in England and Scotland and other places that the English rule would be like theater. It would be sporting events. It would be something like dancing. Little things that we do on a daily basis that we don't think are a big deal, you're not allowed to do anymore in England because it is not moral. It is a very, very strict way of living. Although he was very strict, Oliver Cromwell, he tolerated almost all forms of Christianity, except for, of course, the Catholics. Now, if you tolerate something, what does that mean? Well, if you tolerate something, that means you put up with it, Okay, so even though he's very strict, he tolerated a lot of different forms of Christianity, with the exception of Catholicism. Now, Oliver Cromwell was a military dictator. He ruled by his military. He was very powerful and he was very strict. And the English people, the English subjects, started getting really sick of this. And they didn't like this, and they didn't like him. They wanted to bring back the monarchy. They wanted to restore the monarchy. And that's exactly what that term means at the very top of the slide, is restoration. When you restore something, that means you bring it back. So Parliament wanted the return of a monarch, and they asked Charles I's son to become king, which means Charles II is now King of England. But remember, what did they do to Charles I? Yes, they publicly executed Charles I. So now, after killing Charles I, they asked Charles I's oldest son to become King of England. And he does. A couple things to mention about Charles II. We've already mentioned his father was Charles I, who was executed. I've already mentioned what restoration means, and it was a time period where Charles II takes over and brings back the monarchy to England. It's no longer run under a military dictatorship. It's no longer run under the Commonwealth. Now, under Charles II, Parliament comes up with the idea of habeas corpus. And we actually here in the United States steal this idea of habeas corpus, which is translated into to have the body. And I'll explain exactly what that means. It allowed prisoners to appear in front of judge or judges to specify the charges brought against them. So once again, if you commit a crime, you're just not going to be thrown in jail forever and they're going to throw away a key. It doesn't work that way. If you're accused of a crime, at some point you will appear in front of a judge. He will explain the charges brought against you, and then you will have a fair trial. Prisoners could not be held without a trial. That's really important. So I want you to think of people here in the United States that commit crimes. I've already mentioned it before, but if you commit a crime, you will go to court first. Depending on the severity of the crime, there will be a trial. And in that trial, there are juror members. And both sides of the stories will be told. And it is the job of the jury to find that person either guilty or innocent. And if the person is found guilty, then it is the judge's job and responsibility to sentence that person. So we are actually, here in the United States, stealing all these ideas that are occurring in England in the early 17th century. Okay, so it's very important for us to understand that. Now, after Charles II dies, he has no children, just like Elizabeth. Okay, he has no children. So the throne is going to go to James II. And James II is the brother of Charles II. But James II is not liked at all. He's actually almost hated for one reason. James II is Catholic. And Parliament are all Puritans. So if you have a Catholic king and Parliament are all Puritans, you're not going to agree on anything. So what happens is when James II takes over as King of England, he starts to appoint or give several of his Catholic friends high office jobs, high government jobs, which means the laws that are going to start being created are going to start changing. These laws could possibly start favoring Catholics and not favoring the Puritans, which makes up a majority of the population in England. So that is a huge, huge problem. And Parliament knows that this is a big, big problem. But the biggest problem of all is that James II has a son, which means when James II dies, his son will take over as king. And his son is also Catholic. So now the English people and Parliament are thinking that there is going to be a very, very long reign of English Catholic kings, and they don't want that. And they need to do something about it, and they need to figure it out quick. So what they do is Parliament goes to Mary. And Mary is actually the daughter of James II. But Mary is not a Catholic. Mary is actually a Protestant. And she is married to William of Orange. And William of Orange is actually the Prince of the Netherlands. And they are both Protestants. And I need to backtrack a little bit. I think I mentioned that the majority of Parliament were Puritans. That's a mistake. The majority of Parliament are Protestants at this point, which is another form of Christianity. So, Parliament goes to William and Mary, who are both Protestants. Majority of Parliament are Protestants. And they ask the two to overthrow her father. And if you overthrow your father, James II, we will make you the new king and queen. So they are asking Mary to overthrow her own father. And she agrees. And what ends up happening is that William, her husband, who's also Protestant, who will become King of England, forms his army, his military, and they start marching towards England, James II. Even before William and his army can get there and confront James II, James II leaves and he flees and he goes to France. This is known as the Glorious Revolution, which is an event where it was an overthrow of James II. No one fought, no one was killed, there was no bloodshed whatsoever. So once again, this was known as the Glorious Revolution, the overthrow of James II. But before William and Mary could even become king and queen, they had to sign a very, very important document. And this very important document is actually going to influence many other countries around the world after them, including us, the United States. It really, really influenced us when we wrote the Constitution and our U.S. Bill of Rights. We basically borrowed a lot of the ideas from the English when we wrote these documents for our own country. So in order for William and Mary to become king and queen, they had to agree to sign this. And they would not be an absolute monarchy. They could not do whatever they wanted to do. They would have to follow a set of rules and laws just like everyone else did. And that is known as a constitutional monarchy. So this is going to really, really limit the power of the king and queen. And it's going to give more what to the subjects and people? Well, hopefully we know it's going to give them a lot more rights. Okay? So here's a couple points that we really need to understand about the English Bill of Rights. There is no suspending of Parliament laws whatsoever. So just like the previous kings, like Charles I, you cannot dissolve Parliament anymore. You're not allowed to do that as a king or queen. You have to follow the laws that Parliament creates. Just because you are king or queen, that does not mean you can do whatever you want to. Okay, that's point number one. There is no levying of taxes without a specific grant from Parliament. So once again, levying means to raise. That king or queen is not allowed to raise any taxes without permission or consent of Parliament. Point number three, there is no interfering with freedom of speech in Parliament. Freedom of speech, that is a right that we have here in the United States. Once again, we're borrowing this stuff from the English. But Parliament cannot be scared to say what they want to say. They are all entitled to their own opinion, to freedom of speech. So number three is very important. Finally, number four, there is no penalty for a citizen who petitions the king about grievances. Okay, one word in there we need to understand what a grievance is. A grievance is a complaint, Okay? So all point number 4 means is that if you don't like something that the king or queen does, you can speak up about it. You can actually say, I don't like this law. I don't like what the king or queen is doing or saying. And there's nothing that the king or queen can do about that whatsoever. That's very similar to the third point, which is freedom of speech. But before, if you were caught saying something bad about the king or queen, they could throw you in jail, no questions asked, for the rest of your life. So it's really, really important, everyone, that we are really understanding the transition from an absolute monarchy where the king and queen has all power, transitioning to a constitutional monarchy where the king or queen's power is very limited and more rights are going to be given to the subjects, to the people. And this is going to really lead us into what is known as a democracy. So please, at any point, rewind this video lecture, replay if you don't understand something. If you still don't understand something, please raise your hand so I can come by and I can help you out.